when a weary police officer pointed her gun at Keanu Reeves during a quiet grocery run. She had no idea who she was targeting or the storm her actions would unleash. What began as an ordinary evening of almond milk and kale quickly spiraled into a moment of reckoning, sparking a national conversation on justice, dignity, and the power of standing together. Before we dive into this extraordinary story that left millions speechless and ignited a firestorm of conversations about justice, I want to take a moment to connect with you, our incredible community. Where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you believe that standing up for what's right can truly make a difference, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs a little inspiration today. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening in Los Angeles. The kind where the hum of checkout scanners and the faint murmur of casual conversations filled the air. Among the bustling aisles of a neighborhood grocery store, a figure moved quietly and deliberately, blending into the crowd. Keanu Reeves, the Hollywood icon loved by millions, was dressed simply in a black hoodie and jeans. He pushed a modest cart, scanning the shelves for almond milk and kale, embodying the unassuming charm that has earned him admiration not just for his talent but for his kindness. The soft glow of the supermarket's fluorescent lights cast a familiar hum over the aisles as Keanu Reeves pushed his modest shopping cart through the dairy section. The clinking of carts, the rhythmic beeping of checkout scanners, and the gentle rustle of plastic bags formed a mundane symphony that seemed to cocoon everyone in the safe monotony of their evening routines. Keanu moved with quiet grace, his simple black hoodie and worn jeans blending seamlessly into the crowd. There was no entourage, no flashy distractions, just a man buying groceries after a long day. He reached for a carton of almond milk, the kind he always bought, and placed it in his cart. His movements were slow and deliberate, reflecting the kind of mindfulness he'd learned over the years. Fame, for all its glitz, had taught him the value of savoring the small, ordinary moments like this one. Yet, as he adjusted his cart and moved toward the produce aisle, a prickle of awareness crept up his spine. Keanu had long mastered the art of sensing when he was being watched. At first, he brushed it off as a passing glance. After all, who wouldn't take a second look at a global superstar casually browsing for kale? But this wasn't admiration or curiosity. It was something sharper, heavier, a gaze that lingered too long, like a shadow following him through the fluorescent-lit aisles. He glanced over his shoulder and caught sight of her, a police officer, standing stiffly at the end of the row. Her uniform was immaculate, her hand resting conspicuously near her holstered weapon. Her eyes, narrow and scrutinizing, locked onto him with an intensity that felt out of place. Keanu gave her a polite nod, the kind of small gesture that had defused countless awkward interactions before. But this time, it didn't work. She didn't smile. She didn't nod back. She simply stood there, unmoving, watching. Keanu turned back to his cart, pretending to focus on his list. But the weight of her presence didn't leave him. He moved to the next aisle, scanning shelves for canned goods. But with each step, he felt her following. The sensation was like a thread pulling tighter and tighter, fraying at the edges of his composure. He adjusted his posture, his grip tightening on the cart handle. Years of martial arts training for his action roles had honed his awareness, teaching him to read a room, to assess threats without escalating a situation. Yet here, in the mundane setting of a grocery store, that awareness felt like a burden. By the time he reached the frozen food section, the unease had settled into a low hum in his chest. Keanu tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was just on edge after a long shift. Or maybe he reminded her of someone she'd once arrested. But the explanation didn't sit right. Her presence wasn't incidental. It was deliberate. He paused in front of a freezer, scanning the shelves for frozen berries. The cold air brushing against his face provided a momentary reprieve from the heat building inside him. As he reached for a bag, the officer's voice cut through the quiet like the crack of a whip. "Excuse me, sir. I need to speak with you." Keanu turned slowly, his expression calm but his heart thudding against his ribs. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink, the bustling noise of the store fading into the background. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his tone measured, as though his words were carefully chosen stepping stones across an unpredictable river. Her posture stiffened. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area. I need to know what you're doing here." Keanu blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the absurdity of the accusation. He gestured to his half-full cart, the almond milk and kale sitting innocuously among the other items. "I'm grocery shopping," he replied simply, a faint trace of incredulity threading through his otherwise calm voice. Her eyes flicked to the cart and back to him, her suspicion unwavering. "I'm going to need to see some identification." Keanu let out a soft breath, his mind racing through the options in front of him. The scene was starting to draw attention. A few shoppers had paused mid-step, their curiosity piqued. He could feel the weight of their stares pressing in, the low murmur of whispers growing around him. "Identification?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with disbelief. "For buying groceries?" Her jaw tightened, her hand inching closer to her weapon. "Sir, I'm not going to ask again." The air between them thickened, and in that moment, Keanu felt the familiar sting of being unfairly singled out. It wasn't new, but it was no less painful. He raised his hands slightly, a gesture of calm surrender, and took a slow breath. "Officer, I'm just trying to finish my shopping," he said, his tone as steady as the foundation of a house weathering a storm. "If you think I've done something wrong, let's address it. But if not, I'd appreciate being treated with respect." Her face reddened, the tension between them pulling tighter with each passing second. And as the murmurs in the store grew louder, Keanu realized that this was no longer just a private confrontation. This was a storm-gathering force, and he was standing at its eye. The moment hung heavy in the air, like a taut wire threatening to snap. Keanu Reeves, his voice steady but carrying the weight of unease, stood in the middle of the frozen food aisle, his hands raised just enough to signal calm. Across from him, the officer's gaze remained locked onto him, her hand resting on her holstered weapon. "Sir, I'm not going to ask again," she repeated, her tone laced with authority and frustration. "Show me your ID, or I will escalate this situation further." Keanu took a slow breath, the kind he had practiced countless times during years of meditation and martial arts training. He met her gaze evenly, careful not to show anger or defiance, knowing that any misstep could worsen the already fragile situation. "Officer," he said, his voice low but firm, "I respect the work you do, but I'm just a guy buying groceries. There's nothing suspicious about what I'm doing here." The officer's expression hardened, her posture stiffening further. "You've been pacing up and down these aisles, acting strange. That's enough for me to question you. Now, are you refusing to cooperate?" Before Keanu could respond, a faint murmur rippled through the air. Shoppers had started gathering at the edges of the aisle, their eyes darting between Keanu and the officer. Some whispered quietly to one another, while others began discreetly raising their phones to record. "This is Keanu Reeves," one man muttered, his voice filled with disbelief. "What's she doing? He hasn't done anything," a woman said, clutching a toddler to her chest. The officer seemed to notice the growing attention but refused to back down. Her hand tightened on the handle of her weapon, a gesture that sent a visible wave of unease through the crowd. Keanu felt the weight of their eyes, their collective anxiety pressing down on him like a physical force. He glanced around, meeting the worried gazes of mothers, children, and elderly shoppers. The realization hit him hard. This wasn't just about him anymore. His voice softened, carrying a calm yet urgent tone. "Please, let's not do this here. There are children watching. We can handle this without making it something it doesn't need to be." But the officer's resolve didn't falter. She took a step closer, her voice rising. "Get down on the ground. Now." A gasp rippled through the crowd, and a palpable tension filled the room. Keanu hesitated, his pride and dignity wrestling with the harsh reality of the situation. Getting on the cold, dirty supermarket floor felt like a step too far, a humiliation too great. "Officer," he began again, his tone edged with quiet determination. "This is unnecessary. I'm not a threat to you or anyone else here. I'm just asking for a little respect." "Respect?" she snapped, her voice sharp with frustration. "Respect is earned by following orders. Now get down before I have to make you." Keanu slowly crouched to his knees, lowering himself to the floor with a dignity that belied the humiliating act. Around him, the crowd shifted uncomfortably, their murmurs growing louder. "This is wrong," someone said, their voice filled with anger. "Why is she treating him like this?" another shopper demanded. A young man stepped forward, holding up his phone. "Lady, you're way out of line," he called out, his voice steady despite the obvious tension. "Step back," the officer barked, pointing a warning finger at him. "This doesn't concern you." "But it does," a woman shouted from behind a nearby display of apples. "You're scaring people. And he hasn't done anything." Keanu, still on his knees, glanced up at the crowd, the sight of their outrage, their willingness to speak out despite the clear danger, stirred something deep within him. He had spent a lifetime in the spotlight, often alone under its glare. But now, in this moment of vulnerability, he felt the power of collective solidarity. "Thank you," he said softly, his words directed at the crowd but loud enough for the officer to hear. "Thank you for standing up, for being brave." The officer's face flushed with a mix of frustration and embarrassment as the weight of the crowd's disapproval bore down on her. She looked around, her confidence visibly wavering as more voices joined the growing chorus of dissent. "Let him up," a man shouted. "You're out of line," another called. Keanu turned his focus back to the officer, his voice steady despite the rising emotion in his chest. "Officer, please," he said, his words carrying the gravity of someone who understood the fragility of the moment. "Let's end this. We can find another way to resolve this without causing more harm." For a moment, her hand hovered over her weapon, her eyes darting between Keanu and the crowd. The tension was almost unbearable, the air thick with the possibility of escalation. And then, just as the situation seemed poised to spiral further out of control, a voice broke through the chaos. "What's going on here?" The store manager, Mark, stepped forward, his presence commanding and calm. His eyes quickly assessed the scene: Keanu on the floor, the officer's hand on her gun, and the crowd brimming with outrage. "This is Keanu Reeves," Mark said, his tone firm but even. "He's a regular customer here. What exactly do you think he's done?" The officer opened her mouth to respond but faltered under the weight of the crowd's scrutiny. Her grip on her weapon loosened, her confidence cracking. Mark turned to the crowd, raising his hands. "Everyone, please, let's give them some space. We'll sort this out." The murmurs quieted slightly, but the phones stayed raised, their cameras still rolling. "Officer," Mark continued, his voice softening, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Let's de-escalate this before anyone gets hurt." The officer hesitated, the conflict in her expression clear. Finally, she stepped back, releasing her grip on the weapon and allowing her hand to drop to her side. Keanu rose slowly, dusting off his jeans. His expression remained calm, but his voice carried the weight of his frustration as he addressed her directly. "Thank you for stepping back," he said. "But this isn't right." The officer's face reddened, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned and walked toward the exit, her posture rigid as the crowd parted to let her through. Keanu turned back to the crowd, his face a mixture of gratitude and weariness. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for being here, for speaking out. It means more than you know." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the aisles as Keanu stood there, humbled and deeply moved. for all the tension and humiliation he had just endured. He knew this moment wasn't just about him, it was about the strength of community, the courage of standing together, and the power of refusing to stay silent in the face of injustice. As the officer retreated a few paces, the tension in the store began to ease, but only for a moment. The crowd remained vigilant, their eyes darting between Keanu Reeves, now back on his feet, and the officer, whose composure wavered but did not break entirely. The confrontation seemed to have reached a turning point, but no one could have predicted what came next. The officer suddenly halted her retreat and turned sharply toward Keanu, her frustration bubbling over into an irreversible act. Without warning, her hand moved to her holster, and in a flash, the weapon was drawn. "Hands where I can see them," she barked, her voice cutting through the tense silence like a razor. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Mothers pulled their children closer. Shoppers ducked behind shelves, and the buzz of murmurs turned into sharp whispers of disbelief and fear. "She drew her gun?" someone said, their voice incredulous. "On Keanu Reeves?" another echoed, their tone thick with outrage. Keanu's pulse quickened, but his expression remained steady. He had faced moments of extreme tension on screen, but this was different, raw, unscripted, and terrifyingly real. He raised his hands higher, his voice calm and measured. "Officer," he began, his tone unwavering despite the adrenaline rushing through his veins. "There's no need for this. I am not a threat. Please, think about what you're doing." Her grip on the gun tightened, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. The crowd grew bolder, their murmurs swelling into a wave of defiance. "This is insane," a man shouted, stepping forward with his phone raised. "You're pulling a gun on an innocent man. Put it away," another voice called out, anger lacing their words. Keanu scanned the crowd, his heart swelling with gratitude at their support but also concern for their safety. The last thing he wanted was for the situation to spiral further out of control and put anyone at risk. "Everyone, please," Keanu said, his voice rising slightly to address the crowd. "Stay back. Let's not make this worse." The officer's face was flushed now, her resolve cracking under the weight of the mounting pressure. But she still didn't lower the gun. Her voice quivered slightly as she barked another command. "Get on the ground. Now." Keanu hesitated, his pride and humanity warring against the humiliating demand. But then his gaze fell on a young girl clinging to her mother, her wide eyes filled with fear. It was a look he'd seen before in war films, in disaster zones, and in the faces of real people who had been caught in the crossfire of chaos. And in that moment, Keanu made his choice. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered himself to the ground, his knees pressing into the cold tile floor. The crowd erupted in protest, their voices rising in unison. "This is wrong. Let him up. You're making a mistake." Keanu looked up at the officer, his expression calm but resolute. "I hope you understand," he said softly. "This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. And it's about you, too." The officer faltered, her grip loosening slightly as confusion flickered across her face. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I mean, we're all human," Keanu said, his voice carrying an unexpected warmth. "We all make mistakes, but we're also capable of choosing to be better. Right now, you have that choice." The crowd fell silent, their collective breath held as they watched the exchange unfold. Even the officer seemed momentarily stunned, her weapon lowering slightly as she processed his words. And then, from the edge of the crowd, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. "Officer Stevens." A young man stepped forward, his face pale but determined. It was Ethan, the store employee who had spoken up earlier. This time, his voice carried more urgency, more strength. "Please," Ethan said, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "You don't have to do this. I know you're just trying to do your job. But this isn't right." The officer turned her gaze to Ethan, her expression a mix of frustration and vulnerability. "Stay back," she warned, though her tone lacked its earlier force. But Ethan didn't back down. He took a cautious step closer, his voice steady despite the fear etched into his features. "I've seen him here before," Ethan continued. "He's a good man. He's just buying groceries like the rest of us. Please, let him go." The officer hesitated, her grip on the gun faltering further. Around them, the crowd began to murmur again, their voices filled with hope and encouragement. "She's listening," someone whispered. "Come on." Another urged. "Do the right thing." Keanu remained on the floor, his hands still raised, but his eyes locked onto the officers. "You can end this," he said gently. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone. Just let it go." For a long, agonizing moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. And then, with a shaky exhale, the officer finally lowered her weapon. I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely audible. The crowd erupted into applause and cheers, their relief palpable. Ethan rushed to Keanu's side, helping him to his feet as the store manager, Mark, stepped in to guide the officer away from the scene. Keanu dusted himself off, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. He turned to the crowd, his voice carrying the weight of the moment. "Thank you," he said, his words directed at every face in the room. "Thank you for standing up, for being brave, and for reminding us all of what really matters." As the crowd applauded once more, Keanu turned to Ethan, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. "You made a difference today," he said, his voice filled with genuine warmth. "Never forget that." Ethan nodded, his eyes shining with pride. "Neither will I," he replied. And as Keanu left the store that day, the videos captured in those tense moments began to spread across the internet, sparking conversations about justice, humanity, and the courage it takes to stand up for what's right. But for Keanu, the true victory was the reminder that even in moments of darkness, the light of compassion could shine through. The events of that evening, captured on dozens of phones, spread like wildfire across the internet. By the time Keanu Reeves reached his home later that night, his phone was buzzing incessantly. Friends, colleagues, and fans from around the world were sending messages of support, links to viral videos, and articles that were already surfacing. Social media platforms were ablaze with hashtags like #JusticeForKeanu, #racial profiling, and #DoBetter. The footage was impossible to ignore. Clips showed Keanu kneeling on the cold supermarket floor, his calm and measured voice contrasting sharply with the escalating actions of the officer. The crowd's outrage, their calls for justice, and the moment when the officer finally lowered her gun, all of it was on full display, sparking a collective wave of indignation and empathy. Major news outlets picked up the story overnight. Morning shows aired the videos. Commentators dissected the confrontation, and panels debated the broader implications of racial profiling and abuse of authority. Keanu's name dominated headlines, but the focus wasn't just on his fame, it was on the universal themes of justice, humanity, and the courage of ordinary people who chose to stand up for what was right. Keanu, ever the reluctant hero, felt the weight of the moment as he sifted through the messages and videos. He hadn't sought this spotlight, and yet, he couldn't ignore the responsibility it carried. Sitting in his modest living room, he reflected on the events that had unfolded, the fear in the eyes of the shoppers, the bravery of the young employee Ethan, and the raw, unfiltered humanity of the crowd's support. All of it played over and over in his mind. The next morning, Keanu decided to break his silence. In a short but heartfelt video posted to his social media accounts, he addressed the incident with the grace and humility that had endeared him to millions. "What happened yesterday was deeply unsettling," he began, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of emotion. "Not just for me, but for everyone who witnessed it. I want to thank those who spoke out, who stood up, and who reminded us all of the power of unity and compassion. He paused, his expression thoughtful. This isn't about me. It's about something much bigger. It's about how we treat one another, about the systems we've built, and about the change we need to see. I hope this moment sparks conversations that lead to action, and I'm committed to being part of that change. The video quickly went viral, amassing millions of views within hours. Fans and followers flooded the comments with messages of support, sharing their own stories of injustice and calling for systemic reform. Keanu's words struck a chord, resonating with people from all walks of life. Meanwhile, the police department faced mounting pressure. The officer involved in the incident was quickly identified as Laura Bennett, a 6-year veteran of the force. As her name trended online, public records began to surface, revealing a troubling history of complaints about her conduct. Activists seized on the opportunity, demanding accountability not just for Officer Bennett but for the broader culture within law enforcement. The department issued a statement the following day, announcing that Officer Bennett had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. But for many, this wasn't enough. Protests began forming outside the department's headquarters, with demonstrators holding signs that read "Enough is enough" and "Justice for all." Ethan, the young store employee who had stood up for Keanu during the confrontation, found himself thrust into the spotlight as well. He was interviewed by local news stations, his humble demeanor earning him praise from viewers who hailed him as a symbol of courage. "I just did what felt right," Ethan said in one interview. Keanu didn't deserve to be treated like that. No one does. As the days passed, the incident continued to dominate headlines. Keanu was invited to appear on a major talk show, where he spoke candidly about the experience. Sitting across from the host, he exuded his trademark humility and thoughtfulness. "This isn't about blame," he said, his tone measured. "It's about understanding. It's about recognizing where we've gone wrong and working together to fix it. I don't hold any hatred in my heart, but I do hold hope. Hope that we can learn from moments like this and grow into something better." His words resonated deeply, sparking a new wave of conversations online. People shared their own experiences with bias and profiling, using Keanu's story as a catalyst for broader discussions about equity and justice. Behind the scenes, Keanu took action as well. He reached out to advocacy groups, lending his voice and resources to initiatives aimed at promoting police reform and fostering community dialogue. He quietly funded training programs that focused on de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity, hoping to prevent similar incidents from happening in the future. Ethan, too, found himself inspired to do more. With Keanu's encouragement, he began working with local organizations to create spaces for young people to learn about standing up against injustice and using their voices for positive change. The incident, while painful and deeply unsettling, became a turning point, a moment that transcended the supermarket aisles and ignited a movement. It reminded people of the power of collective action, the importance of standing up for one another, and the humanity that connects us all. On a sunny afternoon weeks later, Keanu stood before a crowd of hundreds at a community rally. Families, students, activists, and everyday people filled the park, holding signs that read "Justice for all" and "Together we rise." As he approached the microphone, the applause was deafening, but Keanu raised a hand, signaling for calm. "Thank you," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Thank you for being here, for caring, and for believing in the power of change." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "What happened to me could happen to anyone. That's why it's so important that we don't stay silent, that we speak up, and that we demand better not just for ourselves but for everyone. Because when we stand together, we're unstoppable." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices a powerful testament to the unity that had grown from one moment of injustice. Keanu stepped back from the microphone, a small but genuine smile crossing his face. As he looked out at the sea of faces, he felt a deep sense of gratitude and purpose. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time in a long time, felt like they were moving in the right direction. Together, the supermarket confrontation, once a singular and intense moment, had evolved into a spark igniting a broader movement. The video footage continued to dominate conversations online and in the media, but it was no longer just about Keanu Reeves. The story had become a symbol, one that highlighted the systemic issues plaguing society and the urgent need for change. As the days turned into weeks, the momentum only grew. Protests sprang up in cities across the country, driven by a shared demand for accountability and fairness. The hashtags #JusticeForAll and #DoBetter trended globally. But this time, they weren't just words on a screen. They represented a groundswell of people from all walks of life coming together to challenge the status quo. Keanu, though initially reluctant to be at the center of this growing movement, understood the importance of using his platform for something meaningful. In a heartfelt speech at a community rally attended by thousands, he addressed the crowd with the same humility and grace that had defined his response to the supermarket incident. "This moment," he began, his voice carrying across the crowd, "isn't about me. It's about all of us. It's about the kind of world we want to live in, the kind of world we want to leave behind for our children." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "We can't change the past, but we can shape the future. And it starts with standing together, speaking out, and demanding better from ourselves and the systems meant to protect us." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the park as Keanu stepped back, allowing other speakers to take the stage. Activists, community leaders, and even former police officers shared their perspectives, each adding their voice to the collective call for reform. One of the most poignant moments came when Ethan, the young store employee who had stood up for Keanu during the confrontation, was invited to speak. Nervously gripping the microphone, Ethan looked out at the sea of faces before him and took a deep breath. "I'm just a regular guy," he began, his voice shaky but growing stronger with each word. "I never thought I'd be here, speaking to all of you, but that night in the store, I saw something that wasn't right, and I couldn't just stand by. And now, looking at all of you, I realize something important. None of us are just regular people. We all have a voice, and when we use it together, we can make a difference." The crowd gave Ethan a standing ovation, their applause filled with admiration for his courage. In that moment, he embodied the message of the movement, that ordinary people, when united, could achieve extraordinary things. Behind the scenes, tangible changes were already taking shape. Keanu collaborated with Mark, the store manager, and several local advocacy groups to launch a series of community programs aimed at bridging divides and fostering understanding. These initiatives included workshops on de-escalation training for law enforcement, implicit bias education, and open forums where residents and officers could come together to share their perspectives. The efforts didn't stop there. Keanu quietly funded scholarships for young people pursuing careers in criminal justice and social work, ensuring that the next generation of leaders would have the tools and knowledge to make meaningful change. Mark's store became a hub for community engagement, hosting regular events that brought people together to discuss and address the issues highlighted by the incident. Nationally, the movement gained traction as well. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at increasing police accountability, while organizations dedicated to social justice reported surges in donations and volunteer signups. The ripple effect was undeniable, with conversations about systemic reform taking place in boardrooms, classrooms, and family living rooms across the country. Through it all, Keanu remained steadfast in his commitment to the cause. He appeared on talk shows and news segments, not as a Hollywood star, but as a man humbled by the experience and determined to make a difference. His words were always measured, his focus always on the bigger picture. "This isn't about tearing down," he said in one interview. "It's about building up, building systems that work for everyone, communities where people feel safe, and a society where dignity and respect are the standard, not the exception." As the months passed, the initial intensity of the viral moment gave way to something deeper and more enduring. A movement grounded in hope and driven by action. People from all backgrounds joined together, their collective voices creating a powerful force for change. It wasn't just about addressing one incident. It was about transforming a culture and creating a future where moments like the one in the supermarket were no longer possible. On a crisp autumn morning, Keanu attended the opening of a new community center, built in part with funds raised by the movement. The center, named Unity House, was a testament to what could be achieved when people work together toward a common goal. It featured classrooms for educational programs, spaces for community gatherings, and a dedicated team of counselors and advocates. As Keanu walked through the center's bright, welcoming halls, he was approached by a young boy clutching a notebook. "Mr. Reeves," the boy said shyly, "can I ask you something?" Keanu knelt to the boy's level, his kind smile putting the child at ease. "Of course," he said. "Do you think the world will get better?" the boy asked, his eyes wide with curiosity and hope. Keanu paused, considering the weight of the question. Then, with a gentle but confident tone, he replied, "I believe it can, and I believe it will, because of people like you, people who care, who want to make a difference. Together, we can make it better." The boy nodded, his smile spreading as he hugged his notebook tightly. As he walked away, Keanu stood and looked around the bustling center, his heart filled with a deep sense of purpose. The road ahead was long, but the path was clear, and it was one they would walk together. The movement born from a single moment of injustice had grown into something far greater, a testament to the power of unity, the strength of compassion, and the belief that even in the darkest of times, change was possible. And for Keanu Reeves, it was a reminder that the most profound roles we play are the ones we never expected.